raising taxes actually isn't very hard. It's only hard when you tie your hands on so many tax locks. As we said before the election, you shouldn't tie your hands in such severe ways because you never know how the world is going to change. I think Rachel Reeves is seeing that now, and I suspect wishing that she hadn't tied her hands quite so severely before she knew what she needed to do. Hello and welcome to this very special episode of the IFS Zooms In, which we are recording in front of a live audience in London and as part of the Economic and Social Research Council's Festival of Social Science. I'm Helen Miller, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And today we are once again talking about the hot topic in town, taxes. Rachel Reeves will soon unveil her second budget, and I think it's now widely expected that she will increase taxes significantly. She has taken the highly unusual step of giving a speech and a press conference just a few weeks before her budget to lay out what she sees as having changed about the world and why she faces difficult decisions in the coming weeks. This was, I think in Treasury speak, pitch rolling for tax rises to come. So today we will look at the levers available to a tax-raising Chancellor. This is not to say that we think she should raise taxes. That is obviously a political choice. But if she does want to raise more, we'll look at how she could do that. We'll look at how much the Chancellor could raise if she's willing to break one of her manifesto tax pledges, and at how hard it would be to raise significant revenue if she wants to stick to those pledges. We'll consider potential tax increases on those with the broadest shoulders, including higher taxes on lawyers, landlords and lifetime gifts, and on expensive homes. And we'll highlight the tax levers that she should not pull in the upcoming budget. And joining me to talk about those two things are Stuart Adam, who is my colleague at the IFS, and who is what I like to think of as our in-house encyclopedia of all things tax policy. Stuart's been working on tax policy for the best part of a quarter of a century now, so has seen many budgets. I'm also delighted to be joined by Dan Neidle, who is a tax lawyer by background and the founder of Tax Policy Associates, who now also regularly comment on tax policy options. So I have the perfect panel tonight. I think we should start this episode by highlighting, that while it is now widely expected that Rachel Reeves will raise taxes, we don't know the scale of what is to come. And that's because we don't know how big a fiscal consolidation the Chancellor would need simply to continue to meet her borrowing rules, or the extent to which she'll want to go further than doing the bare minimum in order to build a bigger buffer against her borrowing rules, in order to ensure that we're not here again in a year's time having another tax-raising budget. It's also, of course, possible that she could find some spending cuts. So we don't know the overall scale of any potential tax increases. I think that scale matters for all sorts of reasons, but including because I think it's very different to be trying to raise 10, 15, 20 billion than trying to raise something north of 30 billion. And I think the more she wants to raise, the more likely it is she breaks one of those manifesto pledges. And interestingly, the Chancellor has this week denied or not confirmed those manifesto pledges, maybe indicating that she may breach one of them. And the one that's being talked about most is income tax. So let's talk about that. And Stuart, you can kind of see why, if she were going to break a manifesto pledge, income tax would quite quickly get her some significant sums.
Yeah, increasing rates of income tax is the most straightforward way to raise large amounts of revenue. A penny on the basic rate gets you 8 billion or so. A penny on all rates of income tax gets you 10 or 11 billion. So some newspapers were reporting last week that she's considering 2p on either the basic rate or all rate. So you can be thinking in the order of 15, 20 billion just from that.
Yeah, it's an attractive option, Dan?
I think most economists and tax policy wonks would say if you're going to increase tax, that's the way to do it, because it's not distortive, it doesn't create lots of uncertainty bubbling through parts of business. Everyone knows what it means. The small downside is the politics.
And it's not really a small downside, right? Because, increasing rates of income tax would very obviously breach the letter of the manifesto pledges.
It
says you will not increase the main rates of income tax.
That
basic
tiny detail aside, I think as a lawyer, you sometimes look at the words and say, it's the spirit that's more important here, Helen. What if you cut employee national insurance by 2p and put income tax up by 2p? Then the average worker, in fact, all workers, all employed people, would see no change at all. And maybe you could say, I'm not a philosopher or a politician, that's not really a breach of the manifesto, but it would collect a handy $6 billion. It would also be, dare I say, good tax policy. Employee national insurance is a bad distortive tax that applies to some forms of income and not others. It should ideally go. This is a step in that direction.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's an interesting case where you could argue that it's breaking the letter of the pledge, but not the spirit, where normally, more commonly, we think of it the other way around. And good tax policy, I think, is more debatable. I think you can make a case for it, but you can make a case against it.
Go on, make a case against it.
Well, in that basically what income tax applies to that national insurance doesn't is income from savings, investment, landlords' rental income, pension income, things like that. And that taxing those more does discourage saving and investment in a way that we might not want to do, that certainly has disadvantages and downsides, as well as actually discouraging working to earn the capital that gets invested in those things in the first place.
I think that $6 billion figure is assuming that you're not raising the dividend rate of income tax.
Right, but the same still applies to discouraging people from investing in property, or putting money into a pension.
Didn't the previous government want to discourage people from investing in property?
Well, let's come back to the landlords. I want to talk specifically about landlords because I think they might be in the firing line. But sticking with income tax, the government could raise some significant sums. Obviously, if they cut the national insurance rate at the same time, they'd raise less. So from their point of view, there's a trade-off that you get less if you're only going to raise income tax effectively on some types of people. Before we move on to other things, thresholds is something where they didn't explicitly write down we won't not freeze thresholds, and there's also some juicy sums there if they were going to continue the freeze in thresholds.
Yeah, so all income tax national insurance thresholds are frozen at the moment, have been for a few years. One widely speculated option is that she could extend that freeze by a couple more years up to the end of the Parliament. Given the OBR's last inflation forecast from the spring, that would raise about 10 billion or so, again, a substantial chunk. Now, the wording of the manifesto was quite interesting in that respect. It said, we will not raise national insurance or VAT or the basic, higher or additional rates of income tax. So it clearly leaves open that on income tax, she could do things to thresholds or, for that matter, to the tax base, the definition of what it is that's taxed. One caveat to that is that at the moment, income tax thresholds are aligned with national insurance thresholds. And so if you kept them aligned, it would still actually technically breach the manifesto pledge not to increase national insurance, whereas breaking that alignment just to avoid breaking the pledge would seem a bit unfortunate. I think the other thing I'd say about this is that while on current inflation forecasts, it would raise about 10 billion. The amount that the freeze so far has raised has been radically different from what they expected at the time they announced it, because inflation didn't turn out to be what they thought it was going to turn out to be. It turned out to be a much bigger tax rise than they were intending. And that's, in some ways, my biggest concern with this policy, that if you want to raise revenue by reducing thresholds, that is a reasonable choice, and we can discuss the pros and cons of changing thresholds versus changing rates. But if you want to reduce the thresholds, you should be deciding how much lower you want them to be. You shouldn't let that be an accidental byproduct of what inflation turns out to be. So if you want to say we are going to reduce thresholds in real terms by X%, I would much rather see that than see them say we're going to freeze it for another couple of years, and how big a tax rise that turns out to be, who knows?
But they don't want to say anything. They want to keep it super quiet and hope no one notices, which has worked really well for the last, 6 years they've been doing this.
I think it's like a £50 billion increase. Is that the right scale? Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
I think that was your figure last year. It must be more now.
Depends what you count.
Yeah, I'm going to say it depends.
It's a chunky multi-tens of billions of pounds. But I think you're right, Dan. I mean, it's clearly seen as the sort of stealthier way to go because people don't immediately see it. And it wouldn't kick in for another couple of years, and it would raise a significant chunk.
But it's kind of crazy how many people pay the higher rate now. When it was introduced, I think 3% of, need to decide 3% of what? I think it was 3% of taxpayers paid the higher rate. And we're now not far away from a point where the median full-time employee will be paying higher rate, I think in about 5 years, if current trends continue. At that point, are people suddenly going to notice this freezing of rate? Or we end up with everybody paying the higher rate?
Yeah, my prediction is that before we get everyone paying the higher rate, fiscal drag will come to an end. But you're right, we have.
But it's happened before. There used to be a rule in the employee benefits legislation for higher paid employees, and that was there for about 30 years. It was abolished. By the time it was abolished, 5 years ago, the higher paid employee threshold was at £8,500 a year. So fiscal drag can go on a long time.
Yeah, it sure can. OK, so Rachel Reeves could increase rates. She could do some more fiscal drag. Either of those things could raise her, the simple versions would raise her at least £10 billion. So you can see why those things are on the table. Before we move away from the big taxes, I want to talk about national insurance contributions. I suspect we're not looking at an across-the-board increase in national insurance rates because on the employer side, she did that last year. And on the employee side, there were the Jeremy Hunt cuts that went through that the Labour Party voted for, didn't object to and didn't reverse.
Your assumption of political consistency is wonderful, Helen. I approve.
You've got to start somewhere. But there has been this idea floated about putting some equivalent to national insurance contributions onto partnerships. So perhaps first, maybe Stuart, we should explain what the issue there is and why it is the case that what's going on. Why is this an issue we're talking about?
Yeah, the basic issue is that if you're in a partnership, which includes big law and accountancy firms, but also most GPs and lots of others, you are self-employed for tax purposes, and therefore the self-employed NICS rate is slightly lower than the employee rate, but the big difference is that there's no employer national insurance on your income. And that means that there is a big tax advantage to being self-employed, or rather to contracting with someone who's self-employed rather than hiring an employee who you'd have to pay employer NICS.
So in a nutshell, Dan, I mean, the idea floating around is you just take an equivalent of employer NICS, call it whatever you like, and you shove it onto partnerships. What do you think?
Obviously, lawyers do fantastic work and shouldn't pay tax. That's very good. That's my view. There's another way to view it, which is this. Imagine you've got a banker and their wages and bonus pooled together come to £1 million. There is going to be employer national insurance on that. There'll be employee national insurance. There'll be income tax. Imagine a law firm partner who earns £1 million, and there are a surprising number of them. And they do great work and should be rewarded for it. But are they actually taking more entrepreneurial risk than the banker? I think a lot of the time they're taking less. But on their £1 million pay packet, there is no employer national insurance. And that is really strange. Now, law firms aren't organised like that for tax reasons, or at least weren't originally. They had to be partnerships until, I think, the 80s. And many of them still do because they have US lawyers and US bar requires to be partnerships. So for law firms, it's kind of not deliberate. But this turned out to be such a wonderful wheeze, particularly once the government enabled limited liability for partnerships, that kind of everyone came in. And now you have architects, hedge fund managers, pension fund managers, private equity managers, dentists, all kinds of people use partnerships, not because they love the partnership ethos, but because of employer national insurance. So from a tax policy consistency perspective, it is absolutely rational to say this is crazy and the lawyers should pay more tax and no one's going to cry for them. The problem comes with many examples in the tax system where you have inconsistency, that a bit like fixing a faulty Lego model. If you just fix one brick, it kind of reveals other problems. So, okay, let's do it. Let's tax LLPs. But you've got to tax other partnerships too. Otherwise, it's inconsistent and you'll have avoidance. But then you're taxing GPs and everyone loves GPs. Okay, let's say we tax partnerships and LLPs. What you'll have is individual partners breaking away from law firms and setting up as barristers, not in partnerships, or as self-employed consultants. So really, to be consistent, you've got to apply employer national insurance to them too. And once you do that, you've got to apply it to plumbers. And at that point, you have revolution in the streets of Slough. So once you set down this path, you either have to commit to going all the way along and having revolution, or you have to say, well, okay, we'll pick some messy intervening point, which isn't perfect, but it's better than where we are now. And I think you could do that by taxing the big partnerships. And you'd raise quite a lot of money. And I'm going to be deeply unpopular in the city for saying this.
Well, I mean, not tons and tons. I mean, we're not talking about the same scale of money that you get from like a penny on income tax, right? You're like low single-digit billions.
A billion here, a billion there. Sooner or later, you're talking about real money.
Yes. Yeah. But it's something that you and I have written a lot about, Stuart, and about, as Dan said, there's a problem basically between you have a sort of a tax penalty on employment relative to other forms of self-employment or running your own company. And this is basically a proposal that would move the boundary. And there are kind of two problems with that. One is, as Dan was saying, you're just moving a boundary and therefore there could be new problems around the new boundary. But there's the other problem that you sort of started getting into with the landlords that I sort of cut off with about there are sort of two things that can in principle be different about people who are running their own businesses. And you have to think about the tax base as well. So I'll let you do that because that's one of your favourite things.
Yeah, so I think there is a very strong case for saying that if all you're doing is working, providing your labour, but you happen to be doing it through a form that is classified as self-employment for the tax system, there's no reason that you should get lower tax rates. As you know, a lawyer versus the banker is a good example of that. But if you're starting to think about a wider group of partnerships or the self-employed more generally, and in that respect, I'd go down the revolution on the streets approach rather than try and put the boundary somewhere else and cause a whole new set of problems. But some people who are self-employed for tax purposes and for legal purposes are doing something different. They may be running a business, they may be investing their capital, they're taking risks, they're being entrepreneurial and so on. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that they deserve lower tax rates, but I think what it means is that we need to recognise what it is that they're doing that's different. And so if they're investing, we need to take seriously, treat properly the costs of that investment, specifically in terms of giving proper deductions for the amount of capital they're putting into the business. If they're taking risks, I don't think that we actually want to encourage risk-taking. There are lots of bad risks, but we don't want to discourage it either. And that means cushioning the downside through things like the treatment of losses as nearly as possible, symmetrically to the way that we tax the upside, as far as you can go without opening up scope for abuse, which can be a danger in the treatment of
lawyers.
Of
you think lawyers would abuse the system?
No, never. But so my approach would be to say, well, let's take the self-employed and, for that matter, those getting their money through their own company, tax their income as heavily as employees' income is taxed in terms of the headline marginal rates, including employer NICs and all, but with proper deductions for the amount of capital they're investing and dealing with, and also gets further in terms of starting to deal with the treatment of debt finance versus equity and all the rest of it. But sort out the tax base, what it is that we're applying these rates to, as well as aligning tax rates across different forms of income.
The problem with that is we haven't had a single Chancellor for maybe since the early Gordon Brown years, who wanted to do any kind of sorting out or reform. It's about little changes here to bring in more tax, little changes here to add on a complication there. To step back and do something for the sake of good tax policy or for the sake of growth or for the sake of some other coherency just doesn't happen. We
should still talk about it because I think it's the thing that should happen.
Yes.
And actually, there are some maybe reasons for optimism in that, some of the things the government did last year, for example, around inheritance tax and pensions, I think probably fell into the trying to reform the system for better reasons. So it certainly hasn't happened in a big bang, here's a great solution kind of way, but it has, you can see little inklings of it, little pockets of it some places. And actually, I think we're all agreeing here on the sort of the good end run solution would be to have this fixed tax base, aligned rates. At least if you have that as a clear end point, you can start to plot paths towards. And actually, imagine that Rate Reeves did say, I'm going to increase a tax on partnerships. As you were saying, Dan, it absolutely is just moving a boundary. I'd be happy with that if it was pitched as and here's a part of a move towards something. And we've thought about it, and we've thought about why the boundary is better here than there, as opposed to just I'm just going to do that because we can get some money out of it. So I think that if it's part of a broader plan, I think it's more acceptable if it's a pathway towards something better. But that's lawyers. Let's talk about landlords, that other really popular group, because I think you can see the same issues arising there, right? So landlords are people who get income, they pay income tax, not income, they don't pay the equivalent of national insurance contributions. As you were saying, Dan, you have this wheeze where you put up income tax and you cut national insurance. That's one way of trying to get more income tax towards them. People also talk about, do you want to just put national insurance contributions or some equivalent on their income? But, Stuart, you and I had a little mini-series on tax recently. We talked a lot about this, but it's the same issue, isn't it? You want to both think about how you tax their income and think about the tax base.
Yeah, exactly. So what I think it would be perfectly reasonable to tax landlords' income at higher rates than we do, but if we were giving proper recognition for the purchase cost of buying a property in the first place, and say taxing them only in excess of a certain rate of return that they could expect to get if they just put their money in the bank or whatever, only tax them in excess of that. And at the moment, while it's true that there is no national insurance on landlords' income, the tax treatment of landlords is actually pretty penal because of things like the fact that higher rate tax-paying landlords can't deduct their full mortgage interest costs anymore, where the cost of investment ought to be deductible. But especially when you compare the treatment of rental property to the treatment of owner-occupiers, who don't have to pay any tax at all on the sort of the rental income you can imagine them paying for themselves, the benefit of living in the property after they've bought it, and don't have to pay capital gains tax if it rises in value. I think, the kind of piling in ever harder on landlords just because of the sake of it, because they look like an easy target politically, again, without thinking of the design of the system, what it is that we're taxing landlords on, how it compares to other investments, to owner-occupiers, is something I'm wary of. It's also something, as we discussed in a previous episode of the podcast, something that doesn't just hit nasty landlords, because rents then rise and tenants suffer from higher rents as well.
Yeah, I think landlords get one of the worst tax treatments in the whole tax system because they're not taxed on the actual real income. They're taxed on a fictitious income because they can't deduct most of their financing cost. Even worse, if they come to sell, say over the last 10 years in London, they'll have a paper gain on their property that they're taxed on, when actually they've lost money in real terms. So the dumb way to do it would be to restore tax relief for interest. The better way to do it, as Stuart says, is to say, well, we'll tax you on your return beyond gilt return or beyond inflation return or some other measure which makes sense economically, and then you can do it at a rate that's coherent with employment dynamics.
Yeah, I think they're both great examples where, in principle, for lawyers and landlords and other groups, it might look superficially like you just want to put up their rates, but actually thinking about the tax base, what they're actually being taxed on, is really important. There's this two-part solution: fix the tax base and then think about rates. I think politicians far too often just go for the fiddle with rates bit and not think about what's being taxed. Let's talk about pensions, because if Rachel Reeves is looking at a shopping list of tax-raising options and looking at where the big numbers are on that list, she will very quickly see that there's a big number attached to pensions tax relief, the sense that you give upfront income tax relief on pension contributions. But I suspect that all three of us are going to say, no, don't do that. So, Stuart, why don't you kick off with why it's a big, juicy number sitting there, but we're going to say, don't leave it alone.
Yeah, so if she were to restrict tax relief on pension contributions to the basic rate, we'd be talking about 20 billion or so raised. That is potentially a really hefty sum. I would say, please don't. And I would say up front, I actually do think there are ways you could raise more revenue from pensions taxation and even from the better off through pensions taxation, but this isn't the right way to do it. I think in practical terms, there's actually a difficulty for people with defined benefit pensions, where actually figuring out what is the individual's notional contribution to their pension is actually really quite hard and will make this practically difficult, which is one reason that governments that have looked into this in the past have shied away from it. But I actually think even as a matter of principle, it wouldn't be a good idea. Essentially, we give tax relief on. I mean, I'm slightly uncomfortable even talking about it as tax relief. We don't tax money put into a pension because we tax it when it's taken out of the pension instead. And it kind of makes sense either to tax it when it goes in or to tax it when it comes out, but not both. And what we would be doing by restricting pension tax relief is putting some tax on up front for higher rate taxpayers and then taxing them again when they got the money out. So I think there isn't a coherent rationale for doing that. Obviously, for people who are higher rate taxpayers throughout their lives, it looks particularly penal and just not outright unfair, as far as I can see. The argument that people often make is that many people are higher rate taxpayers when they're putting money into the pension, but only basic rate taxpayers when it's coming out. Now, I actually think you can make a good case for why that's a good idea, because actually the fundamental issue there is that having an annual income tax with graduated rates penalises people who have variable income through their lives. And actually, when people are putting money into a pension and getting high rate relief and then paying basic rate tax in retirement, all they're doing is smoothing their taxable income across time. And so you end up taxing them more like their average lifetime income, which is probably what we'd prefer to tax in the first place. I think there is a good case for saying that. If you really don't like that, I would still challenge you to say, why is it unfair for someone to pay high rate tax, get high rate relief, but only pay basic rate tax in retirement, if you're not also going to say it's unfair for people to pay to get basic rate relief on their pension contributions and pay no income tax on retirement because they're below the personal allowance, which is a far, far more common situation, but people don't seem as bothered by. Now, I can understand people aren't as bothered about it because these people just aren't as rich. But if you want to tax the rich, if you want to tax better off people, there are ways you can do that. It doesn't, to me, make sense to say we're going to apply different principles for how we tax money going into pensions and coming out of pensions for different kinds of people. Sorry, that was a longer answer than it was intended to be.
What do you think, Dan? You on board with that?
Tragically, I agree with all of it.
That's great.
I mean, the point about defined benefit pensions is really hard. So you can imagine some formula like they used to have for the lifetime pension cap, where you kind of fudge it and you say, okay, don't work it out. We'll treat you as having a contribution each year of this. Problem is that all of these doctors and civil servants would then need to pay additional tax on this, whatever it is, and with that to revolution in the streets of Slough. And so I suspect politically the only way it would work is if you didn't apply it at all to defined benefit pensions, which seems completely unjust. So I don't really see how you square that circle. So without even getting into the fine arguments of principle, just practically, politically, it doesn't really fly.
Great. So let's assume that Rachel doesn't go for the juicy sum and listens to our advice. Let's look at some of the smaller tax.
Well, hang on. Before we move on, what about national insurance? So you get, essentially, it's not called that, but you get national insurance relief on contributions to a pension most of the time. At least when the employer's paying it, and if it's a salary sacrifice. You don't if you put it in your SIP. But in those cases, you did. But when you're then getting drawdowns to the pension, you do not pay national insurance on them. But that violates Stuart's sacred principle. We should have relief on one side, tax on the other side. Here we have relief on one side and no tax on the other side. So I say, tax the pensioners.
Well,
vote for me.
Slough's going to be busy. No. But Dan's not, there's a good point there. Pensions is the biggest form of remuneration that gets no national insurance contributions at either end. And we've written Stuart about he might want to think differently about the employer bit of it, the employee bit of it, and put some up front and some at the end. But you could certainly start thinking about trying to put some form of national insurance contributions on pensions.
Yeah, absolutely. And you could go about dealing with that either by looking at tax on pension income or looking at tax on employers' pension contributions. But yeah, when I said at the outset, I think there are other things that you can look at as ways to raise tax from pensions. That's absolutely at or near the top of my list. The other one I'd highlight is the 25% tax-free element, which is capped only at, well, what used to be the lifetime cap on pensions, which means we're giving a subsidy even to people who've got quite a lot in their pension already to save even more. And while I can see the case for subsidising pension saving up to a certain level, why we subsidise people with even with large pensions to save even more in them is less clear to me. The other thing that bothers me about that is that the fact that it's 25% tax-free means that it is worth more to higher rate taxpayers than to basic rate taxpayers, and worth nothing at all to people who aren't taxpayers in retirement. And again, why we want to subsidise pension saving more for people who are going to have high income in retirement, and not at all for people who are going to have low income in retirement. If anything, we should be, doing it the other way around, but at least levelling it off. So I think there are plenty of reforms that you could make in revenue-raising ways if you wanted to the pension system.
Can I disagree with Stuart on that?
Go on then, yeah, go for it.
Great.
I think that's a typical communist IFS proposal, to be honest. There's a deal. I make contributions to my pension because I'm expecting to get tax relief, and I'm expecting to pay tax on the way out, and I'm expecting to get that 25% lump sum. And that's why I do it, and that's why people have been doing it for many years. And it's not technically retrospective taxation, but it kind of feels wrong for government to change that deal.
Hey, but you were just saying you want to change the deal on national insurance contributions.
Yeah, that's a stupid deal. Yeah, that's a stupid, unfair deal. It's different. It's totally different. And it's also, I think it's something that isn't widely appreciated. But you've caught me out in a hideous inconsistency, which I'm going to just sail past and say that it's different. It's clearly different. The audience is with me on that.
I think the serious point there is that pensions are a long-run thing, and it is damaging for the government to be regularly changing them and changing expectations. This is absolutely an area where I think the government needs a plan. They need to put out their plan and then say we're sticking to it, and not have the constant speculation about whether the 25% element or the next one will change. So I think we're on the same page about that. But look, lots of ideas about how to raise more money from pensions, which are clearly a popular option. Let's whiz through some other options so we can give listeners a sense of what else might be on the Chancellor's option list. One of the kites that's been flying since summer, really, it's getting quite tiresome, is about taxes on expensive homes. I think there's lots of speculation there. Lots of different ways you could do that. What do you think, Dan? If the Chancellor wants to get some more tax on expensive homes, what would you do?
So council tax is not a great tax. It was designed in a hurried panic after the poll tax riots. It's got lots of weird features, and one of the weirdest features is it's still based off 1991 valuations, which means, for example, that someone like Walthamstow, the number of houses in the top bands is incredibly low. There are only 10 houses in the whole of Walthamstow in Band H and 20 in Band G. There are thousands in Islington, even though house prices, the differential between the two is not that great, but 1991 valuations. So that's crazy. The other crazy thing is the most expensive house in the country will only pay twice as much council tax as an average house, at least in England, because that's the way the rules work. And an obvious thing to do is to add more bands at the top. And it seems like fair and obvious that someone in a 100 million penthouse should be paying tax more than someone who lives in a fairly modest Islington house that happens to be in the top band or the second top band. And it seems like the right thing to do. How much do you think it would raise if you did that? Am I allowed to ask the audience things? If we add a new band, we make it kind of 3 or 4 times as much council tax, who thinks it will raise $1 billion? Who thinks it will raise $2 billion? You guys all know the answer, you're really boring. Pretend to be surprised. The answer is that it raises hardly anything, because there just aren't that many big houses. And Margaret Thatcher said the problem with socialism is you run out of other people's money. I don't think I agree with that, but the problem with a lot of this kind of tax the rich thing is you run out of other people. There are not enough big homes to individually tax with council tax and raise a lot of money. So the thing that was leaked, kite flown in the weekend papers to double council tax on Band G and Band H, that raises quite a lot. That raises £2 billion. But
4 billion.
Sorry, was it 4 billion?
Yeah, Stuart did the number.
Sorry, it was 4 billion, and I did the number as well. It is. We're going to have an edit there. It raises 4 billion, and if you did,
Let's do it again without the laughing.
It raises $4 billion. But if you dig into the numbers, which I did before I forgot that I had, you find that of that $4 billion, 80% comes from Band G, not Band H. So those people in Islington, in Band G, in houses that actually are not that fancy, suddenly have their council tax doubled. People in equivalently priced houses elsewhere in the country that are in lower bands do not. And you're creating a massive gulf between bands F and Band G, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And you're not taxing the super wealthy at all. You're taxing the kind of comfortably wealthy. So it's a funny proposal that doesn't quite do what one would expect.
So you can see why the doubling of Band G and Band H has a sort of like simplicity to it, that you don't have to do anything. If you wanted to add more bands, you would have to revalue at least some subset of properties. As you and I talked about earlier, Stuart, once you start revaluing some, actually you might as well revalue the whole stock, and therefore once you've done that, you can have a sensible council tax and you're away. But there's also an issue there about whatever you did, about whether the money would flow to local government or whether there's a way to get back into central government.
Yeah, so, I mean, any increase in council tax by default would go to local councils. Now, you could say, great, let them keep it. Local councils are strapped for cash at the moment. But if you're Rachel Reeves looking to raise revenue for, the Exchequer, central government, meet your fiscal rules, and you wanted to get the revenue in for that, then there are a couple of ways you'd do it. Probably the simplest is to say, well, we'll let councils get this extra revenue, but we will adjust the way that we fund local authorities. So we'll essentially cut the grants that central governments give to local councils and claw back that revenue for central government. The other thing you could do is just make it directly a central government tax. So, for example, you could say that Band G and H properties have to pay a certain amount to their local council, but also a certain amount to central government as essentially a separate tax. You could still get local authorities you could still get local authorities to collect it and just hand over the revenue. It's more of a pain because you would need primary legislation in order to set up what would essentially be a new tax. So I think the easier way would be to reduce grant funding. It's still a little bit of a pain because you've just done a spending review and set out how we're going to fund different departments and so on. So you annoy people, but you could do it that way.
You also end up, if you double the bands, that someone with a second home is now paying quadruple council tax. And when, as would surely happen, Wales copies the new bands, someone in Wales with a second hand will pay sextuple council tax. And when you think of the effect that will have on house prices, I don't want to sound too alarmist, but it kind of feels confiscatory in terms of its effect.
We're certainly talking about pretty hefty taxes. It may be that if council tax was increased that much, they didn't feel the need to have such high taxes on second homes. But yeah, they could do, and you could do it. And maybe they're happy to have confiscatory tax rates on holiday homes and whatever.
So another idea that was floated around, at least at some point, was the idea of putting capital gains tax on the gains made on primary residences, on main homes. That currently doesn't exist. I suspect we're all going to agree that they shouldn't do that because regardless of whether you want to do it in principle, in practice, the minute you start doing that, everyone just says, whoa, I'm not selling my house now because you wait for the next government to take it away.
Particularly if opposition parties came out and said, what a terrible idea, if we win the next election, we'll get rid of this. Who's then going to sell their house ahead of the next election?
Yeah, not me.
It's one of these ideas which attracts headlines every so often because the figure that HMRC put on the cost of that relief is really, really large. I can't remember what it is, Stuart Wills.
It's big.
It's like 20 billion, 30 billion. It's a really big number. But actually, there's no country in the world that I'm aware of that actually taxes people on the gain when they sell their house. There are lots of countries that say they do it, but then they allow you to roll over the gain to your next house. They give you a big exemption each. So no one's actually paying tax on that. So the idea we could in the UK actually collect that 30 billion, I think is nuts, even if you didn't have the problem of people just not selling, which is what would happen.
So no to CGT on homes. What do you think about capital gains tax more generally, Dan? Think they could turn there for some more money?
Yeah, I think capital gains tax. Problem with capital gains tax is it is too high and too low at the same time. So
I agree.
Yeah, I buy a house for £500,000 10 years ago. I sell it for £600,000 today. I'm going to pay capital gains tax on the £100,000 gain. But I haven't made a gain. I've made a loss that I can't quite work out now, but I've made a loss of probably £150,000 or so, maybe a little more. So the effective rate of tax I'm paying is not the headline rate of 24%. The effective rate of tax is, and my maths has completely lost me, several 100%. It's a disaster. And not only houses, it is a problem with actual investment, and it affects people's willingness to make long-term investments because they know that if it performs less than spectacularly, they will be paying a penal rate. And that's before you get into the fact that any losses they make, a capital loss is not a very useful thing. So the rate of capital gains tax is too high. The rate of capital gains tax, however, is also too low. If I haven't made an investment at all, but I've just magically transferred my labour income into capital, then I never made an investment at all. There's nothing for inflation to erode, but my income is now taxed at 24%, which is too low. So what we need to do is tax long-term investment at a lower rate and flipping labour income into capital at a higher rate, which sounds a complicated thing to do, but it's a very easy thing to do. Because all you have to do is equalise the rates and then give an allowance for investment. Well, it's such a revolutionary communist thing to do that Nigel Lawson did it in 1988. And if you look at his budget speech, he made an extremely clear elucidation of why it is that you do it. So it's just a shame that we've had non-stop fiddling with capital gains tax since 1998. And we are where we are now with a rate that is too low and too high at the same time. Yeah. Oh, and if you make that change, you can also raise a pile of money. Should have added that.
Yeah, and this is, again, goes back to what we were talking about towards the start of the podcast. This is a classic case where it's fine to increase the rate, but you need to change the tax base, what it is that you're taxing. And you've mentioned one way in which changing the tax base would cost money, that it's too high at the moment, which is we need to give proper allowances for the amount invested. But actually, in this case, there are also some ways in which changing the tax base could actually raise you more. And my biggest personal bugbear on this is the treatment of capital gains at death, where at the moment, any rise in the value of the asset from when you buy it until you die basically gets written off. There's no capital gains tax at the point of death, and the person who inherits the asset is deemed to acquire it at its value at death, not at the original purchase price. So that rise up until death never gets taxed. And that also is one of the things that makes raising rates of capital gains tax less effective than it otherwise would be, because if you increase the rates, it just means that more people sit on and hold on to their asset and hold on to that capital gains until death so that the tax never has to be paid. So this is one area where actually changing the treatment at death so that, for example, the person inheriting the asset inherits it for the original purchase price, not for its value at death, could actually raise you a couple of billion in itself, as well as making rate increases more sensible and more effective. But I mean, I also wholeheartedly agree that the point about giving a proper allowance for investment as well.
Yeah. Another great example where reforming the tax would actually mean that you would do less economic damage for any tax rate, and you could raise more revenue because you'd have removed some of the distortionary effects. Okay, let's do some quick fire other options that are floating around. Gambling taxes, Stuart.
You could raise more revenue from it. I think one thing I'd say is that we have a particularly complicated system at the moment with, depending on how you count it, about 7 or 8 different taxes on gambling, and we could certainly do with simplifying that a bit. The government is actually looking at doing that in the area of remote online gambling, but more broadly, that there is merit to revisiting the system. I'm slightly worried about how much the debate here has been focused on the revenue that you could raise from it and the potential job losses and so on in the gambling sector, neither of which I think should actually be very relevant to the decision here, because you can raise tax from this, but you could raise revenue from taxing other stuff. The question is, why pick on gambling? And yes, if you raise taxes here, it would result in less gambling and therefore less activity, fewer jobs in the gambling industry. But again, almost any tax rise is going to mean less economic activity and and fewer jobs. And the question is, again, why is gambling special? I think what we need to be doing is saying, well, why do we want a special regime for gambling at all? And the answer is that while most gambling is a perfectly nice, harmless hobby, there really is an issue of problem gambling. But, among a minority, that does real harm to people's lives. And what we ought to be doing, if you think it's the government's role to get involved, to get involved with people's decisions when they may be doing harm to themselves or their families, is basically saying, well, okay, where exactly is the problem gambling, given that most gambling doesn't seem to be particularly problematic? And how do we target that? Are there some types of gambling that we should be levying particularly high taxes on because they're associated with problem gambling? What is the role of the tax system versus regulation and other kinds of intervention that we might introduce to deal with problem gambling? And we should be addressing this by how do we want to deal with gambling as an issue in society as a whole, rather than here's how we could raise a quick buck.
Yeah. So an example where the Chancellor very much needs to think about the point of the tax and not just trying to raise some more money. Switching topics, Dan, banks. Another one where there's been people talking about, do we need to have higher taxes on banks for some reason? What do you think about that?
I feel rather sorry for the bankers. So, first of all, they pay more tax than the lawyers. They pay more tax than the private equity managers. Even people at a bank who's doing an identical job to a private equity manager pays a lot more tax because they don't get carried interest and a low capital gains rate. The banks pay the bank surcharge, a special additional rate of corporation tax. They have the bank levy, which is a particularly complex and bad tax on bank balance sheets, which is supposed to discourage risky behaviour, but actually has the opposite effect. It penalises safe, low-risk activity. So bank taxation's a mess, and banks in this country are overtaxed compared to other countries. So the idea we should load them up with more tax seems quite a poor idea to me. So it's going to happen.
Yeah. Careful thought. I feel like we should mention, at least in passing, the tax gap, because every Chancellor loves to find something where they can say, I found some avoidance or some evasion, I'm going to crack down on that, there's some kind of easy money there. And there is a part of the tax gap. So for small companies, corporation tax, there is now a very big gap between what the HMRC think maybe companies should be paying, what they're actually paying. And if they could get that down, there would be a lot of money there, but that's easier said than done.
It is super weird that over the last 20 years, the tax gap for large businesses has shrunk by about 2/3. Over the same period, the tax gap for small businesses has gone up 3 times. If it had stayed where it was, we'd collect about £10 billion a year more tax. If the gap had reduced in line with large business, we'd collect something like £15 billion a year more tax. So what's happened? Why is it that the small business tax gap has gone up so much? And the answer is, nobody knows. The people at HMRC who do an amazing job compiling the tax gap statistics don't know. Some of it they think is changing methodology, but only some of it. And no one has the answer. I mean, if I lost 10 billion quid behind the sofa, I'd spend a bit of time working out where it is. But successive governments have not been doing that. And the trend doesn't even appear to have been noticed until recently. So it's really, really strange. So if the Chancellor stood up and said, there is a huge problem with the small business tax gap, and we're going to spend considerable resources in working out what it is and working out what to do about it, it wouldn't be the usual political nonsense about magically finding money from a tax gap we can close with no effort. It would actually be a bit real. So I hope she does that.
Good. So we're almost out of time, but are there any other rabbits out of the hats we think we should be looking for? What else might she do? Lifetime gift taxes, maybe?
VAT.
Increase VAT?
No. Obviously,
VAT.
They said they wouldn't increase VAT in the manifesto, so of course they're not going to increase VAT. But what you could do is expand the base.
On Cornish pasties?
Maybe even further than Cornish pasties. So why is it that we have Jaffa cakes, marshmallows, chocolate biscuits endlessly litigated? It's because the boundary between food and not food is irrational. The boundary between children's clothes and adults' clothes is also irrational. If you go on the Harrods website, as I did the other day, you will find girls' gold jackets selling for £8,000 with 0% VAT. I'm reliably informed they're not just bought by the under-16s. So it's an irrational system, and the Chancellor could end it. You could, if you're a brave Chancellor, abolish zero rate VAT on food and on children's clothes. You could give them some of that money immediately back in terms of benefits increase, child benefit increases, tax cuts, so that the average family wasn't worse off. You would make the system more coherent, you would ease up regulation for business, and you would raise a pile of money.
I would, as much as I would absolutely love to see the kind of level of ambition there and the boldness of reform, Stuart and I have complained many times about the absurdity of, everyone's got their favourite example of the boundaries. I think at this particular moment in time, one thing the Chancellor will be worried about, other than the fact that's very bold and courageous, is the inflation issue, about whether that would put up inflation, whether that might lead the Bank of England to delay cutting. And we could debate whether that would happen or not, but that might be one reason why they're nervous about changing VAT at this moment in time. So on that, although we could go on all night talking about tax, I think we should probably draw this to an end. I think it's worth reflecting that, there really are lots of tax options that Rachel Reeves faces. Raising taxes actually isn't very hard. It's only hard when you tie your hands on so many tax locks. As we said before the election, you shouldn't tie your hands in such severe ways because you never know how the world is going to change. I think Rachel Reeves is seeing that now, and I suspect wishing that she hadn't tied her hands quite so severely before she knew what she needed to do. She could raise quite a lot of money while sticking to those tax pledges, but it would be hard. I think the more she wants to raise, the harder it would be to do that. It's also important to think about the economics and not just the politics here. I mean, tax rises are not all born equal. Some are much more damaging than others. And doing lots of small damaging tax increases would not be the place to go. I think a theme through lots of what we've talked about tonight is that reform really offers a prize here. If you can reform some taxes, then you can not only raise whatever revenue you want with lower economic costs, you can do less damage to things like economic growth, but often actually by reforming taxes, you unlock the potential to raise more revenue because there are fewer ways in which people can avoid those taxes. So reform isn't just about having a nice, tidy system, it's actually about having a better system that allows you to raise revenue in less costly ways. I would absolutely love to see the Chancellor set out a bit of a vision for tax, take some steps towards a better system, but at the very least, not take, big steps in the wrong direction or do things that look like they're politically expedient right now and get a few pounds into the Treasury, but actually leave us in a worse place with our tax design. So with that, let me say thank you to Dan, thank you to Stuart, thank you to everyone here in London, thank you to all of you listening. I hope you all enjoy the rest of budget season. We'll keep talking about the budget, so keep tuning into that. If you've enjoyed this particular episode, please do subscribe and share it with your networks, and we look forward to seeing you next time.